A scream shatters the quiet village night, and an old secret awakens. Welcome to Dossiers Mystères. I am your host, Longford. This community is growing fast. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments mean the world to me. I love reading every single one. Now let's step into the mystery. The annual St. Mary Mead Garden Fete was, as ever, the highlight of the summer. Bunting fluttered between the linden trees. Trestle tables sagged under the weight of sponge cakes and preserves, and the scent of roses mingled with the faint aroma of freshly cut grass. Villagers drifted from stall to stall, exchanging gossip with the easy rhythm of people who had known one another for decades. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her lilac shawl despite the warmth, sat beneath a parasol near the jam competition. Her pale blue eyes missed very little. Certainly not Mrs. Caroline Finch's forced laughter as she presented her strawberry conserve, nor the subtle avoidance between Mr. Leonard Cresswell, the new schoolmaster, and Mrs. Temple, the vicar's wife. To most it was an afternoon of harmless frivolity. To Miss Marple, the small dramas of human nature unfolded like a well-thumbed book. It began innocently enough. The raffle was being drawn, and Mrs. Finch, flushed from winning a new set of teacups, was about to give a triumphant little speech when a scream split the air. The crowd turned toward the marquee. There by the cake stall stood Emily Carter, the postmistress, white as a sheet and clutching an envelope in her trembling hands. There's blood on it," she cried. The fete dissolved into chaos. People surged forward, murmuring, speculating, asking foolish questions. The envelope, a plain ivory one with no address, was indeed stained with a dark, rusty smear. Miss Marple rose, adjusting her shawl, and moved toward the scene with quiet purpose. Near the edge of the crowd, she noticed Inspector Craddock hurrying over, called from his leisure day in much Benham, no doubt. When the envelope was opened, the villagers collectively held their breath. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper bearing 6 words, written in a trembling hand. "He knows. Stop her before Friday." Within the hour the fate was forgotten, the raffle prizes unclaimed. That evening, as dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, Emily Carter was found dead in her sitting room, an empty teacup beside her, and the faint scent of bitter almonds lingering in the air. The next morning the village buzzed with speculation. "Suicide," said some. "Murder," whispered others. Inspector Craddock leaned toward the former. After all, Miss Carter lived alone, and the letter seemed quite unrelated to her. But Miss Marple, sipping her tea at the window of her ivy-covered cottage, thought differently. Poison was such a coward's weapon, she mused, and St. Mary Mead had never lacked for cowards. Emily Carter had been a postmistress for 25 years. She knew everyone's secrets. Letters misaddressed, parcels sent in haste, handwriting recognized. And then there was that envelope, so curiously placed at the fete, meant perhaps for someone else entirely. "Friday," Miss Marple murmured softly. "That gives us 4 days, doesn't it, Raymond?" Her nephew, the novelist, had gone back to London long ago, but speaking aloud helped her think. She folded her knitting neatly and reached for her straw hat. There was, she felt certain, something in that letter, something very particular, that would soon disturb the peaceful order of St. Mary Mead again. Would you like me to continue with Part 2? The village reacts, where gossip spreads and the first suspicions begin to take shape. By the next morning, St. Mary Mead was no longer the tranquil picture of summer contentment it had been the day before. The death of Miss Emily Carter, postmistress and pillar of reliability, had sent ripples through every corner of the village. Housewives lingered by their garden gates far longer than necessary, pretending to prune roses while exchanging whispered speculations. At the butcher's, customers forgot their orders as theories were passed over the counter, with the rash enthusiasm of those who relished scandal more than truth. No one could quite decide whether poor Miss Carter had taken her own life or been helped toward it. The envelope found at the fete, its cryptic message now the talk of every breakfast table, was the thread on which the village's imagination dangled. At the vicarage, Mrs. Temple declared it all terribly shocking as she poured tea for her husband, who was less interested in moral reflections than in the theological implications of sudden death. "We must remember," he said solemnly, "that Emily Carter was a good churchwoman, not the sort to despair easily." Mrs. Temple nodded, though she privately wondered if good churchwomen were necessarily immune to despair. In the same hour at the Blue Boar, Leonard Cresswell, the young schoolmaster, confided to the landlord that he had often found Miss Carter a trifle nervous of late, a phrase he repeated with the gravity of one offering important testimony. The landlord, eager to be useful, mentioned that nervous people sometimes did strange things, though in truth he had always found Emily rather brisk and sensible. Meanwhile, Miss Marple was knitting by her window, her thoughts quietly moving from one fact to another. She had stopped by the post office more than once in recent weeks, and had noticed, as she did with most people, little things others ignored. The faint hesitation in Miss Carter's voice when certain names were mentioned, her quickness to change the subject when letters from London arrived, her distracted manner at the fate itself. It was not suicide, Miss Marple told herself. Emily Carter had been frightened, yes, but not hopeless. The letter, with its peculiar wording, "He knows, stop her before Friday," suggested a secret, and secrets, in her long experience, were the most dangerous currency in a village like St. Mary Mead. When Inspector Craddock called on her that afternoon, he found her, as he often did, calm and self-contained, with her silver hair neatly pinned, and her expression one of mild curiosity. "You'll think me fanciful, Inspector," she said, setting aside her knitting, "but I don't believe Miss Carter's death was meant to happen yet. Whoever wanted her silenced acted too soon, or was afraid she might speak." Craddock, though fond of the old lady's observations, smiled in the polite way policemen do when humouring the unorthodox. "There's no sign of forced entry, Miss Marple. No fingerprints but hers. Cyanide, according to the doctor. Likely self-administered, and she left no note." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, but people who mean to die often leave some small evidence of farewell. A letter, an apology, or a careful putting away of things. Emily Carter left her kettle on the hob, and her knitting unfinished. That's not the work of someone who planned to depart the world, don't you think?" Craddock sighed. "If it wasn't suicide, it must have been someone close enough to know her routine. Poison in the tea, the doctor says. The cup was still half full when she was found." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Ah, tea," she murmured. "It always tells the truth if one listens closely." She thanked the inspector for calling, and once he left, sat a long while in quiet reflection. Her mind wandered, not to evidence but to people, to motives wrapped in manners, to faces she had seen at the fete, each revealing a shade of tension under the laughter. Caroline Finch, who had quarrelled with Emily over a delayed letter. Leonard Cresswell, whose correspondence from London had lately been arriving under unusual secrecy. And Mrs. Temple, who had looked distinctly uneasy when the blood-stained envelope was produced. It was all very interesting indeed. That evening, as the sun slipped low over the thatched roofs, Miss Marple took a slow walk to the post office. The building, shuttered and dark, seemed oddly lifeless without its mistress behind the counter. Yet in the stillness there was a faint sense of watchfulness, as though the place itself held on to its secrets. A single flower crushed near the step, a pale pink geranium, caught her attention. She bent to pick it up, studying it with mild curiosity. A strange flower to find there. Miss Carter disliked geraniums and never kept them in her window boxes. Someone had visited recently, someone who perhaps carried the bloom without realizing what trace they left behind. Later, over her solitary supper, Miss Marple considered the phrase again. Stop her before Friday. If Emily Carter had been her, then what was meant to happen on Friday? But if Emily was not the intended target, then another woman in the village might unknowingly stand in danger. It was a thought that made her hand pause mid-air as she lifted her teacup. The faintest unease brushed her heart. She would have to act quickly, though quietly as always. In St. Mary Mead one never hurried, one observed. And sometimes observation could be the most urgent act of all. The following morning dawned pale and misty, with a thin veil of fog curling around the hedgerows, as if the village itself wished to conceal its unease. Miss Marple rose early, drawn by habit and quiet determination. The events of the previous day lingered in her thoughts, like the faint scent of the cyanide that had ended Emily Carter's life. The constable had already returned the letter to Inspector Craddock, who now kept it under lock and key at the station, but Miss Marple had no need of it before her eyes. The words were etched clearly enough in her mind. He knows. Stop her before Friday. There was something desperate in that warning, something that spoke of fear and unfinished business. Friday was only 2 days away. By 9 o'clock the fog had lifted enough for her to see the lane clearly. She took her basket and set out toward the grocer's, nodding to the milkman as she passed. Her presence in the village was as ordinary as the post arriving, or the church bell tolling noon, and so no one thought it strange that she lingered here and there to exchange pleasantries. But behind her gentle smiles, her mind was taking careful measure of every reaction. At the grocer's, she found Mrs. Finch speaking in a hushed, urgent tone to Mrs. Prothero, the schoolmistress. "She'd been meddling again, you mark my words," Mrs. Finch declared, catching sight of Miss Marple and lowering her voice. "Always thought herself too clever, that Emily. If you ask me, she brought it upon herself." Mrs. Prothero pursed her lips and muttered something about sin finding people out. Miss Marple bought her sugar and tea, thanked them both with a mild remark about how gossip could ruin reputations faster than truth ever could, and walked on, her expression unreadable. The truth was beginning to form, faintly like an image beneath water. Emily Carter had known something that frightened her enough to make her careless. The letter's appearance at the fete had not been coincidence. It had been warning or message, misplaced or misdelivered. But to whom had it been intended? Someone present that afternoon, surely. Miss Marple began to recall the faces again. Caroline Finch's flustered delight when she'd won the raffle, the schoolmaster's uneasy avoidance of Mrs. Temple, and Mrs. Temple herself, who had been distracted, her eyes darting toward the road more than once. These were not random behaviors. They were fragments of a pattern. As she reached the crossroads near the church, she encountered Reverend Temple, who stopped to greet her, his mild face lined with fatigue. "Terrible business, Miss Marple. My wife scarcely slept last night. She was very fond of Miss Carter, you know." "Quite upset." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed. I always found Miss Carter a woman of sound judgment, though she did sometimes trouble herself too much with others' affairs." The vicar nodded vaguely, offering that polite, vague sort of sympathy that men use when they do not truly listen. Yet Miss Marple noticed something else. His eyes flicked toward the church porch, as though he wished to be away from the subject. She thanked him and let him go, her thoughts deepening. People often reveal the most by what they avoid. At noon, she paid a visit to the post office again, officially to see whether the post would be reopened, unofficially to examine what remained of Emily Carter's domain. Constable Harrow was stationed there, polishing his boots on the step. He knew Miss Marple too well to question her interest. "Nothing to see, ma'am." "The inspector's already been through the place." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I'm sure he has, my dear boy, but it's astonishing what a man can overlook when he's searching for facts instead of feelings." He blinked at that, but said nothing as she stepped carefully inside. The air still held that faint tang of mustiness, mixed with the ghost of lavender polish. Behind the counter were the tidy shelves, each slot labelled in Emily's neat handwriting. On the desk lay a stack of undelivered letters, tied with string. Miss Marple's eyes fell on one envelope, marked for Mrs. Temple, posted from London 2 days earlier, but oddly without a return address. She said nothing, merely noted its presence before turning to leave. Outside, she encountered Leonard Cresswell coming down the lane, hat in hand, his expression unusually grave. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his tone almost too formal. "I suppose the whole village is talking of nothing else." "Naturally," she replied mildly. "It's not every day St. Mary Mead loses its postmistress." His eyes flickered. "No, indeed. Though, well, she'd been troubled. You could see it, couldn't you? I rather think she'd been blackmailed." He glanced quickly at her face, gauging her reaction. Miss Marple merely tilted her head. "Blackmail, Mr. Cresswell. That's a strong word." He looked uncomfortable. "I may be mistaken, of course, but I saw her once tear up a letter right there in the shop, her hands shaking. Said it was a mistake. I thought at the time it might be something personal." He flushed slightly, as if realizing he'd said too much. "Best not to speculate," Miss Marple murmured. "Speculation leads people to ruin faster than guilt does." But inside her mind his words took root. A letter torn up, hands trembling. Yes, that sounded like fear indeed. That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire, the twilight fading to deep blue beyond the lace curtains. Her teapot steamed quietly, and the clock ticked with patient rhythm. She reviewed everything she had learned. Emily Carter had been frightened, perhaps blackmailed. A letter, misdelivered at the fete bearing a warning to stop her before Friday. Mrs. Temple had received a mysterious letter from London. Friday was approaching fast. And the faint trail of a pink geranium outside the post office still troubled her. Caroline Finch was known for keeping them in her garden. Could that have been her unintentional mark? She was interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, Inspector Craddock stood there, hat in hand. "Evening, Miss Marple. Sorry to trouble you again, but there's been a development. The lab confirmed the tea was poisoned, definitely cyanide. And here's the odd bit, traces of lipstick on the rim. Miss Carter didn't wear any." Miss Marple's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. "How very curious. So someone else poured or perhaps shared the tea?" Craddock nodded grimly. "That's what it looks like. We'll have to question the villagers again tomorrow." She smiled faintly, though her heart was already racing ahead. "Do that, Inspector, and perhaps pay special attention to those who brought flowers to her window that day. You may find your answers among the petals." When he had gone, she turned back toward the fire, her face half in shadow. The fog outside had thickened again, and Friday was now only a single day away. The next morning brought with it a chill wind that rustled the leaves outside Miss Marple's cottage, as if the village itself were whispering uneasily about what might yet come. Friday. The day mentioned in that cryptic message had arrived. Miss Marple rose before dawn, her instincts sharper than the air that drifted in through the half-open window. She made her tea slowly, her mind turning once again to the web of small details, each thread fine on its own, but woven together into something deliberate, almost cruel. Someone had murdered Emily Carter, not out of passion or impulse, but necessity. It was, Miss Marple thought, the sort of crime committed by people who had much to lose and even more to hide. By mid-morning, the village was tense. People spoke softly, as though afraid of summoning something worse than gossip. Inspector Craddock was already making his way from cottage to cottage, interviewing villagers again with a patience that was beginning to fray. Miss Marple, having heard of his progress from the butcher's wife, thought it best to pay a few calls of her own, quite unofficially, of course. Her first stop was Caroline Finch's house, a tidy brick cottage whose garden overflowed with the same pink geraniums that had caught her attention outside the post office. Caroline herself answered the door, her face pale but carefully composed. "Oh, Miss Marple," she exclaimed, pressing a hand to her chest, "I do hope you haven't come to talk about that dreadful business. I haven't slept a wink." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "It's only natural to be unsettled, my dear, but I'm afraid the police will have questions for everyone soon enough. I was merely wondering if you'd spoken to Miss Carter recently, perhaps on the day of the fete." Caroline hesitated, twisting her handkerchief. Why, yes, I believe I did. Only briefly, of course. She said something about having to deliver an urgent letter, though I didn't quite catch to whom. She seemed distracted. There was a tremor in her voice, and Miss Marple noticed how the woman's gaze darted toward the window-sill, where a pot of geraniums sat, one bloom conspicuously missing. "That's very helpful, Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple said gently. "It must be difficult remembering such things under stress." Caroline managed a faint smile. "Oh, it is. I only hope this awful business ends soon." From there, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage. The Temples were both at home. Mrs. Temple was arranging flowers in the sitting room, while her husband pored over his sermon notes. She greeted Miss Marple with forced cheerfulness. "We were just saying how dreadful it is, dear Emily's death. I've scarcely had a moment's peace. The inspector asked to see my post this morning, if you can imagine, as though a letter from London could have anything to do with murder." Miss Marple's tone was calm, almost soothing. "One can never be sure, Mrs. Temple. Sometimes the smallest coincidence hides the greatest clue. You did receive a letter from London, didn't you?" The woman froze for a moment before replying, "Yes, from my cousin. Or rather, I thought it was. There was no return address, but the handwriting looked familiar. So I haven't opened it yet, to tell you the truth. It all seemed too dreadful a time." Miss Marple tilted her head, studying her closely. "Sometimes it's better to face dreadful things, dear, before they grow worse in the dark." Mrs. Temple's hands faltered as she arranged the flowers, knocking over a vase. As the water spread across the table, Miss Marple reached to help her, quietly observing the woman's trembling fingers. There was fear there, deep unspoken fear, not of Miss Marple or the inspector, but of something that had not yet been named. She left soon after, promising to call again, and as she stepped into the crisp daylight she noticed the faintest scent of almonds lingering on Mrs. Temple's gloves. It was barely perceptible, but Miss Marple's mind filed it away at once. By afternoon, word reached her that Inspector Craddock had uncovered a new lead. A scrap of burned paper, found in Miss Carter's fireplace, containing only 3 legible words: "Temple, London, Friday." When Craddock arrived to tell her in person, he found Miss Marple seated at her writing desk, her expression composed but thoughtful. "So the poor woman was indeed mixed up with the vicar's wife," she murmured. "I rather feared that might be the case." Craddock frowned. "You think Mrs. Temple's involved?" Miss Marple's reply was mild, almost evasive. "Involved, perhaps. Guilty, not necessarily. One must never confuse weakness with wickedness, Inspector. Still, the scent of almonds tends to linger where it shouldn't." He stared at her, clearly uncertain whether she was teasing him. "We're keeping her under observation," he said finally. "She's nervous, that's for sure. Her husband too, though he's more the oblivious sort." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Obliviousness can be very convenient, Inspector. It spares one the trouble of lying." When he left, she stood by the window a long while, watching as clouds gathered over the fields. Everything in her told her the true danger had not yet passed. The warning in that letter, "Stop her before Friday," had not been heeded. And now that Friday had come, she could feel the shadow of another act waiting to unfold. Just before dusk, a boy from the vicarage came running up the lane, breathless. "Miss Marple, please come quick. Mrs. Temple's fainted. Mr. Temple says something's happened." Miss Marple was already reaching for her coat before he finished. When she arrived, the household was in disarray. Mrs. Temple lay upon the sofa, her face chalk-white, her pulse faint. On the floor beside her was a broken teacup, the faint smell of almonds unmistakable. The vicar was in tears, protesting that his wife had merely been resting when she suddenly collapsed. Craddock arrived moments later, grim and tight-lipped. "Poison again," he muttered. "Same as Miss Carter's." Miss Marple knelt beside the unconscious woman, her mind racing yet calm. "No, Inspector," she said softly. "Not quite the same. Emily Carter was murdered to keep her silent. Mrs. Temple was meant to be silenced too, but she wasn't killed. The dose was meant to frighten, not to finish." Someone wanted her terrified, desperate enough to do something rash. And if I'm not mistaken, she will tell us tonight exactly who that someone is. Craddock looked at her in disbelief. You mean she knows who killed Miss Carter? Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her voice almost gentle. Oh yes, Inspector. She knows, and she's been running from the truth ever since that letter arrived. But now the running is nearly over. She turned back to Mrs. Temple, who stirred faintly, her lips moving as though she were trying to speak. The storm outside broke suddenly, rain lashing against the windows. Within the flicker of lightning, Miss Marple thought she saw for the briefest moment something like resolve in the dying woman's eyes, a terrible secret clawing its way to the surface. Friday, after all, had arrived, and before it was over, so too would the illusion of peace in St. Mary Mead. For several long moments, the only sound in the vicarage was the ticking of the clock and the hiss of rain against the window panes. Mrs. Temple stirred weakly, her face pale as candle wax, her breath shallow but steady. Miss Marple knelt beside her, the old woman's hands calm and sure as she felt for the faint pulse at her wrist. Inspector Craddock hovered nearby, anxious but restrained, unwilling to interfere with Miss Marple's peculiar methods. Mr. Temple stood by the fireplace, wringing his hands and muttering fragments of prayer under his breath, his confusion and fear painfully genuine. When Mrs. Temple's eyelids fluttered open, she looked around her as if waking from a nightmare. "It wasn't meant for me," she whispered hoarsely. "You must believe that. I didn't know she'd— oh God, I didn't know she'd die." Miss Marple's voice was soft but unyielding. "You mean Miss Carter, my dear? What was it you didn't know?" Mrs. Temple swallowed hard, her throat working as though every word cost her dearly. "The letter," she said. "It was meant for me. Emily tried to warn me. She'd found out something dreadful, and she wanted me to leave before Friday. She said he knew, that he'd stop me. But I didn't understand what she meant until it was too late." Her eyes brimmed with tears, and she turned her face toward the wall, shuddering. Inspector Craddock leaned forward sharply. "Who's he, Mrs. Temple? Who are you talking about?" She hesitated, her lips trembling. "My husband's curate," she whispered finally. "Mr. Leonard Cresswell." The words fell like stones in the silence. Craddock blinked, taken aback. "The schoolmaster?" She nodded faintly. "He came to the village 2 years ago. Charming, clever, ambitious. He helped with the Sunday school at first. Mr. Temple was grateful for the assistance, but then he began calling on me, bringing books, small gifts. I tried to put a stop to it, truly I did. But he was persuasive. I thought it harmless at first, attention, kindness, but then it became something darker. He threatened to tell my husband, to ruin us both unless I helped him. I don't even know what he was after. Money, perhaps, or influence. He wanted something from London. He said Emily knew too much. Miss Marple's knitting bag mind began to piece the strands together, neat and efficient. A misplaced letter, a frightened woman, a man with charm enough to deceive and ambition enough to kill. "And Miss Carter?" she asked quietly. "What did she discover?" Mrs. Temple closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. He'd been sending letters, many letters, using my name. Applications, recommendations, even to the diocese, asking for funds and favors. She noticed because the handwriting was inconsistent. She told me one afternoon that she suspected him of forgery. She meant to confront him, but she didn't realize how dangerous he was. When she found that envelope at the fete, she must have thought it was for me. She wanted to protect me. Inspector Craddock's jaw tightened. So Cresswell killed her to keep her quiet. And now he's tried to finish what he started, with you. Mrs. Temple gave a broken sob. "Yes, he brought me tea this afternoon. I didn't think anything of it. He said I needed rest." Miss Marple exchanged a look with Craddock, an understanding passing silently between them. It was a pattern as old as sin, vanity, deceit, and the small, slow cruelty of a man who believed himself cleverer than others. Within the hour, Craddock had his men searching for Cresswell. The rain had stopped, leaving the village hushed beneath a heavy sky. Word spread quickly that the inspector was on the hunt for the schoolmaster, and shutters closed discreetly as people watched from behind curtains. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned to her cottage, her mind neither triumphant nor relieved, but profoundly alert. There was still something that troubled her. It was all too neat, too expected. Cresswell's guilt fit comfortably, almost too comfortably, and yet she could not dismiss Mrs. Temple's account. The terror in the woman's voice had been real enough. As dusk deepened, she sat by her fire, thinking of Emily Carter's steady, intelligent face, her neat handwriting, her devotion to duty. Emily had been frightened, yes, but she had also been determined. The kind of woman who, if she discovered wrongdoing, would not run but act. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Perhaps Emily hadn't merely been trying to warn Mrs. Temple. Perhaps she had already taken steps to expose the truth, and that was why she'd been silenced so hastily. At that very moment a knock sounded at the door. It was young Constable Harrow, dripping wet and breathless. "They've found him, Miss Marple. Mr. Cresswell, out by the old mill pond. His bicycle in the ditch and, well, he's dead. Shot, looks like suicide." Miss Marple rose slowly, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. "Suicide, you say? How very tidy." The boy frowned, uncertain. "Inspector says he left a note. Something about remorse." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her eyes remained sharp. "Remorse, my dear, is often written for the living, not the dead. It convinces policemen, but it rarely fools Providence." She followed him through the damp lanes to the pond. Cresswell's body lay sprawled near the reeds, his face turned toward the water, a revolver by his hand. Craddock was there, grim-faced, holding a crumpled paper. "His confession," he said shortly. "Admits to poisoning Miss Carter, trying to kill Mrs. Temple. Says he couldn't live with himself." Miss Marple bent slightly, studying the scene. The gun was small, elegant, a type rarely owned by young schoolmasters. The angle of the wound struck her as peculiar, awkward for self-infliction. Her gaze drifted toward the footprints in the mud. 2 sets, one heavier, the other smaller, leading back toward the lane. She said nothing for a moment, then straightened, her voice mild. "You'll forgive me, Inspector, but I should like to look at that note before you file it away." He handed it to her. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, but oddly formal for a man supposedly distraught. And there at the bottom was a faint smudge of red. Lipstick, the same shade she had seen on the teacup at the postmistress's house. Miss Marple's eyes flicked up toward the road, where a single figure stood half-hidden by the hedge, watching. Caroline Finch. She turned away quickly when she saw Miss Marple's gaze. As the constables carried the body away, Miss Marple spoke softly to Craddock. "I don't think this will be your last body, Inspector. Not yet. The wrong person's story has just been ended, and that always means someone else's has yet to be told." The wind picked up again, rippling the water's surface and carrying the faint scent of geraniums on the air. Miss Marple's shawl fluttered in the breeze, and though her face remained serene, her thoughts were far from calm. There was another secret buried beneath this one, and the night, she suspected, would not pass quietly in St. Mary Mead. The night settled heavily over St. Mary Mead, a velvet dark, broken only by the flicker of lanterns moving along the muddy lanes as the constables finished their work at the pond. The village had retreated into silence, doors bolted, curtains drawn. Only a few dared whisper of the dreadful events, that Leonard Cresswell had taken his own life after murdering poor Miss Carter and nearly killing the vicar's wife. To most the tragedy seemed complete, the pattern closed. But for Miss Marple, the simplicity of that conclusion was what troubled her most. Crimes of passion might be simple. Crimes of fear never were, and this one reeked not of passion but of calculation. She returned home past midnight, her lamp casting soft circles of light across the cottage walls. Her cat, a grey tabby named Wellington, greeted her with a questioning meow as she set down her coat. She smiled faintly and stroked his head, her mind already retracing every thread of the day's events. Cresswell's confession was convenient, almost courteous in its neatness, but murderers rarely tidied up so well. And there was the matter of the lipstick, an elegant touch for a man who had never shown the slightest vanity. No, that note had been written for someone's satisfaction, not from a guilty conscience. Someone clever enough to forge handwriting, perhaps the same person who had helped Cresswell in his schemes, or who had turned on him when he ceased to be useful. Sleep was impossible. Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting lying forgotten on her lap, and considered the curious symmetry of it all. A frightened postmistress, a frightened vicar's wife, and now a dead schoolmaster. The phrase from the letter echoed once more in her mind. He knows. Stop her before Friday. Emily Carter had believed that someone meant to harm Mrs. Temple, but perhaps the message had a broader meaning. Stop her. Who was her? Miss Marple's gaze fell upon the mantelpiece, where a single pink geranium in a glass jar caught the firelight. Caroline Finch's flowers again. A woman whose laughter at the fete had rung too high, whose denials came too easily, whose garden had already left its mark at the scene of the first crime. By morning, the village was astir with rumours. Mrs. Finch was seen walking briskly to the grocer's, her head held high, speaking of the poor misguided boy, with an air of tragic superiority. Mrs. Temple remained confined to bed under the doctor's care, her husband pale and bewildered by the sudden collapse of everything he understood. Miss Marple, moving quietly through the day, said little. She paid her respects to the vicarage, brought flowers, and stayed just long enough to hear that Mrs. Temple had not yet regained full strength. Then, as afternoon light slanted across the village green, she made her way toward Caroline Finch's cottage. Mrs. Finch opened the door before Miss Marple could knock, as though she had been expecting her. "My dear Miss Marple," she exclaimed brightly, "how nice of you to call. Do come in. You must be worn out with all this dreadful business." Miss Marple smiled politely and allowed herself to be ushered inside. The air was thick with the scent of geraniums and polish. On the mantel stood a framed photograph of Mrs. Finch's late husband, a naval officer whose steady gaze seemed to watch the room. Miss Marple took a seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "It has been quite distressing," she said softly. "So much sadness in such a short time. One wonders what could drive such a clever young man to despair." Mrs. Finch poured tea, her movements quick and precise. "Ambition, no doubt. Men like that, always reaching higher than they ought. I always said he had a restless eye." Miss Marple accepted her cup but did not drink. "Indeed. And yet one cannot help but wonder who helped him reach so far. I imagine a man like Mr. Cresswell might have needed guidance." She let the words linger, soft as silk. Mrs. Finch's hand trembled slightly, the teaspoon rattling against the china. "Guidance? I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Oh, of course not, my dear," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Only that one hears things. The vicar's wife mentioned you were quite friendly with Mr. Cresswell in the early days. Something about organizing the parish library together." The colour drained slightly from Mrs. Finch's cheeks. "Yes, but that was ages ago. It was nothing. Purely practical." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind but searching. "Naturally, though it must have been difficult for you after your husband's passing. Loneliness makes people so terribly vulnerable to flattery, doesn't it?" Mrs. Finch's teacup halted mid-air. "I beg your pardon?" "Oh, I only meant," Miss Marple said, her tone light as ever, "that Mr. Cresswell was a man who knew how to appeal to kindness. Miss Carter discovered that, I believe. She saw more than she should have, and that frightened him, or rather frightened someone connected to him. And then, when he ceased to be convenient, well, he joined her, didn't he?" The silence that followed was brittle as glass. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window panes. Mrs. Finch set down her cup with care. "I don't think I care for your insinuations, Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight. "The poor man's dead, and I think it unkind to speak ill of him." Miss Marple rose slowly, smoothing her skirt. "Oh, I quite agree. Death deserves dignity. But you see, my dear, death deserves truth as well. And there is still the matter of that note. Such elegant handwriting, don't you think? Not at all like Mr. Creswell's usual scrawl. And the lipstick on the paper. It was your shade, Mrs. Finch. Geranium rose, I believe they call it. For an instant, Caroline Finch's composure cracked. Her mouth opened, then closed again. "You're mistaken," she whispered. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I do hope so, but I fear I rarely am." She turned toward the door, pausing only to glance at the neat rows of potted geraniums lining the sill. "Red is such a bold color, don't you think? It hides so much beneath its brightness." Then she left, closing the door gently behind her. That evening, as the sun slipped low, Inspector Craddock appeared at her gate once more, his face grave. "Mrs. Finch is dead," he said abruptly. "Poison, same as the others. Must have taken it herself. There was a half-empty bottle on her table. We found a note, too. She confessed to helping Creswell, said she couldn't bear the shame." Miss Marple sighed softly, her eyes distant. "Yes, I rather expected that. Though I doubt it was shame that moved her hand. More likely self-preservation. People like Mrs. Finch seldom confess unless someone helps them write the ending." Craddock frowned. "You think someone else?" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that Miss Carter's warning wasn't only about Mrs. Temple. There's still one more person who knows too much, Inspector. And until that person speaks, St. Mary Mead won't rest." She turned toward the window where the last light of day caught the glass, reflecting her calm, unreadable face. Murder, you see, has a curious way of continuing long after the victim is gone. The next morning brought no relief to St. Mary Mead. The village, already trembling under the weight of 2 murders and 1 supposed suicide, now seemed to hold its breath entirely. Church bells tolled softly in the distance, but few attended morning prayers. Curtains remained drawn. The cobbler did not open his shop. Even the children, usually so bold in their curiosity, kept to their mothers' skirts, whispering that the curse of the letter was still upon them. For all their chatter and superstition, they were not far wrong. The letter, its message brief and terrible, had begun it all. And Miss Marple knew it had not yet finished its work. Inspector Craddock, weary from sleepless nights, arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just as she was taking her morning tea. His coat was damp from the mist, his expression grave. "She's gone, Miss Marple. Caroline Finch. Cyanide again, no doubt about it. We found the teacup on the table and her note beside it. Says she helped Creswell blackmail Mrs. Temple, that she was driven to despair by her own guilt." He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "That makes 3 deaths in as many days. I'd almost call it a plague of conscience if I believed in such things." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea, motioning for him to sit. "And yet, Inspector, conscience is precisely what this is about. Or rather, the absence of it. You see, Mrs. Finch may have written that note, but she didn't choose the timing of her end. Murderers seldom leave the stage so conveniently." Craddock frowned. "You think someone forced her hand? But the door was locked from the inside." "My dear Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly, "a lock is no obstacle to someone who knows how to manage appearances. You see, murderers aren't clever because they think of new ways to kill. They're clever because they understand how others see what they expect. Everyone expects remorse after guilt, so Mrs. Finch was made to seem remorseful. Everyone expects a confession at the end, so a confession was provided." He stared at her, then exhaled heavily. "You think someone else is behind all 3 deaths? I don't think, Inspector," she said, setting down her cup. "I know. The real culprit has been directing this little tragedy from behind the scenes, moving others as one moves pieces on a chessboard. Emily Carter saw the first move, and that's why she had to die. Creswell was the next piece to fall, useful at first, then disposable. Mrs. Finch, too, had served her purpose. But there's still one more player, and that player has not yet lost." Craddock leaned forward. "Who, then?" Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the mist clung to the hedges like breath on glass. "That depends on what Miss Carter discovered about those letters. She realized they were forgeries, but there was more to it. Forging signatures for recommendations is foolish, but forging legal documents is quite another matter. I believe one such document passed through her hands shortly before she died. It involved money, perhaps property, and it was addressed to someone in authority. That's what tied everything together. Money? Craddock echoed. From where? The church, most likely, Miss Marple said softly. Donations, funds, perhaps a trust. The vicar's wife might have been the unwitting instrument, her name used, her position lending respectability to the scheme. But she wasn't clever enough to plan it, nor heartless enough to kill for it. No, the true architect would be someone accustomed to control, someone with both moral authority and ambition to protect. She paused, watching him over the rim of her teacup. You've underestimated your vicar, Inspector. I do not believe he's as oblivious as he seems. Craddock's brows shot up. Mr. Temple. But good heavens, he's a man of the cloth. Miss Marple's tone was dry. Yes, and that very cloth often conceals a multitude of sins. I have seen more than one clergyman mistake self-importance for piety. Mr. Temple has always struck me as a man who dislikes disorder. And nothing disrupts order so much as scandal. Imagine, then, the horror of finding his wife entangled in deceit and blackmail. The perfect motive for silence, Inspector. Not passion, but preservation. Craddock looked troubled but unconvinced. He's been distraught, Miss Marple. Half out of his wits since his wife's collapse. Perhaps, she said gently. But grief can be very selective. Sometimes it is only fear in disguise. She stood, reaching for her shawl. I think it's time we paid another visit to the vicarage. There's something I wish to see for myself. The vicar received them in his study, the air heavy with the scent of tobacco and damp paper. Books lay scattered across his desk, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes saw immediately what she sought. A small pile of envelopes, neatly stacked, bearing the official seal of the diocese. Ah, Miss Marple, Inspector, he said, forcing a wan smile. You've come about poor Mrs. Finch, no doubt. Terrible, terrible thing. I scarcely know what to say. Evil has settled over this parish. Evil does have a way of finding its home, Miss Marple murmured, stepping closer to the desk. You must be quite exhausted, Mr. Temple, with so much correspondence on your hands. I noticed the bishop's seal. How reassuring it must be to know the funds for the new mission house are in such capable care. He stiffened. How did you... yes, the diocese entrusted me with certain responsibilities. Purely administrative. Of course, Miss Marple said softly, though I imagine it must have been difficult when Miss Carter began asking questions about those letters. She was a most observant woman. She would have noticed a difference between genuine diocesan correspondence and clever imitations. The vicar's face blanched. You can't possibly think... I think, Miss Marple interrupted kindly, that you were desperate to protect your wife from disgrace. Cresswell discovered your small misappropriation and saw opportunity. He enlisted Mrs. Finch to help, using Mrs. Temple's name to draw the money legally. When Emily Carter realized the forgeries, she tried to warn Mrs. Temple, not knowing you had already learned of her discovery. It was you who visited her that evening, not Cresswell. You brought her tea, kindly, pastorally, and when she died you let suspicion fall where it conveniently should. Later, when the others began to fray, you finished the play by writing a confession and forcing the curtain down. The room fell silent except for the rain tapping faintly at the window. Mr. Temple's hand trembled on the desk, the faint sheen of sweat glistening at his temple. Craddock's voice broke the stillness. Good Lord, he breathed. Is it true, Temple? The vicar's mouth opened, but no sound came. He stared at Miss Marple, and in his eyes flickered a terrible weariness, the collapse of a man cornered by his own conscience. At last he sank into his chair, whispering, I only meant to stop the scandal. Everything spiraled. Emily, Cresswell, Caroline, they wouldn't stop. It was too late to turn back. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression one of infinite sadness. Evil rarely announces itself, Mr. Temple. It begins with small concessions, silences, omissions, and ends in death. You only wish to preserve your peace, but peace bought with deceit always costs more than one intends to pay. When Craddock led him away, the church bell began to toll again, mournful and low. Miss Marple remained in the study, her fingers resting on the bishop's sealed letters. She turned them gently, noting the careful handwriting, steady, precise, and identical to that on the forged confession. The rain eased outside, and she closed her eyes for a moment, murmuring to herself, "The village will gossip, of course. They always do. But they'll never understand. It wasn't ambition or greed that killed them. It was fear, plain and simple." She rose, taking her shawl once more. "And fear, I've found, is the deadliest poison of all." The confession was signed before dusk, written in the same trembling hand that had once guided sermons on forgiveness. Inspector Craddock took it with no satisfaction, only the grim weariness that comes from seeing virtue collapse under the weight of fear. Mr. Temple was taken quietly from the vicarage. There were no shouts, no protests, only the hollow echo of the church door closing behind him. Miss Marple stood in the lane, watching as the constable's cart rolled away toward Much Benham, its wheels crunching softly over the gravel. The mist had begun to lift, revealing the faint blush of evening sky beyond the roofs. Somewhere a dog barked, and life in St. Mary Mead went on, though something essential had shifted, as though innocence itself had packed its things and gone with the daylight. She lingered for a while outside the churchyard, the familiar scent of damp stone and wild thyme filling the air. The truth had emerged at last, yet Miss Marple felt no triumph in it. Justice, in her experience, was never neat. There were always frayed ends, small cruelties, quiet griefs that no confession could mend. She thought of Mrs. Temple, lying upstairs in the vicarage, still too frail to know the full extent of what had been done in her name. When she learned it, her faith might falter, as faith often did when tested by the frailty of those who claimed to embody it. Miss Marple's heart ached for her. To lose a husband was one thing. To lose the illusion of his goodness was quite another. She returned to her cottage slowly, her shawl drawn tight against the chill. Wellington met her at the gate, weaving about her ankles as though sensing her unease. Inside she lit the fire, made herself a small pot of tea and sat by the hearth. The flames danced and cracked softly, their warmth almost enough to banish the lingering damp of the day. She tried to read, but her mind refused rest. She replayed each moment. Emily Carter's scream at the fete, the blood-stained envelope, the strange coincidences that had unfolded like pages in a grim parable. Mr. Temple's guilt was beyond question, and yet there was something incomplete. A final thread tugged at her memory, faint but persistent. She rose, crossed to her writing desk, and pulled out the small notebook where she had jotted her observations throughout the ordeal. Names, times, fragments of conversation, all orderly, all deliberate. Near the top of one page she had written a line in her own neat hand. He knows. Stop her before Friday. The letter that had begun it all. Emily Carter had believed she was warning Mrs. Temple, but that had never quite fit. If the vicar's wife had been in danger, why had the note been brought so publicly to the fete? Why had it been found, not delivered? Emily Carter had been cautious, precise. She would not have risked exposure, unless she intended someone else to see it. Miss Marple tapped the pen against her chin, her eyes narrowing. Perhaps she had not been warning one woman but accusing another. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door, urgent, though not impolite. When she opened it, she found Inspector Craddock standing there again, his hat in his hand, his face lined with fatigue. "I thought you might like to know," he said. "They've moved Temple to the station. He's not talking anymore, just sitting there quoting scripture. We'll take him to the magistrate tomorrow." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And Mrs. Temple?" "She knows enough," he said grimly. "We told her the truth as gently as we could. She didn't faint this time, just sat there staring at her hands. Poor woman. She said she'd rather he'd died an honest man than lived a liar." Miss Marple's gaze softened. Yes, that's a very natural wish. But few people die entirely honest, Inspector. We are all deceivers in small ways. It's when deceit begins to masquerade as virtue that it becomes dangerous. Craddock looked at her curiously. You don't seem quite content, Miss Marple. I'd have thought this case was finished. She smiled faintly. Oh, it is in the eyes of the law. But the truth, Inspector, rarely fits so neatly within a single man's guilt. There are always accomplices, not of action, perhaps, but of silence. He frowned but didn't press her. They spoke for a few minutes more of mundane matters, the report he must file, the coroner's hearing next week, and then he took his leave. When he was gone, Miss Marple stood by the fire once more, staring into the shifting glow. It was then she saw it, the final detail that had eluded her. The bishop's letters, the genuine correspondence Mr. Temple had forged so carefully, bore the official seal of the diocese, embossed in red wax. But the seal she had seen earlier in the day on the fresh stack atop his desk had been brown. A small thing easily dismissed, except that the diocese had changed its seal months ago. Someone had replaced the real documents after his arrest. Someone still sought to protect his reputation, or to protect themselves. Her mind turned swiftly to the only person who could have had access. Mrs. Temple, a widow now in all but name, her life and her husband's career ruined, her social standing undone. A woman who had lived for years in his shadow, submitting to his authority, worshipping his piety. Miss Marple had seen that look before, devotion curdled into desperation. Perhaps it was not shock that kept Mrs. Temple silent, but resolve. Perhaps she intended to ensure that the church's funds, or what remained of them, would be quietly restored before the investigation uncovered more. It was a tidy sort of penance, one that would allow her to preserve what little dignity the family name still possessed. Miss Marple sighed and sank into her chair. She would not interfere. Some truths did not need to be dragged into the light. The law had its limits, but justice in its quiet English way had already found its balance. Emily Carter's warning had been heeded after all, though not as she had intended. Stop her before Friday. The words echoed again, but now Miss Marple understood. Emily had not been speaking of Mrs. Temple. She had meant the church's treasurer, a Mrs. Finch. It was she who had been diverting the funds with Cresswell's help. Mr. Temple had only intervened when it was too late, sealing his own ruin with the same poison that had silenced his accomplices. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her eyes closing briefly in reflection. So much suffering, she thought, born of small ordinary desires, security, respectability, the longing to appear good in a world that rarely forgives weakness. When she opened her eyes, the fire had burned low. The cat slept curled beside her chair, the clock ticked softly, and outside the mist had lifted entirely, leaving the night clear and cold. Tomorrow life in St. Mary Mead would resume as before. Gossip over fences, tea at the vicarage, though under new management, no doubt, and the slow, comforting rhythm of village life. But for now, Miss Marple sat in the dim glow, her thoughts quiet and certain. Evil, she knew, never truly vanished. It simply changed its shape, slipping quietly into new forms, waiting for human folly to call it forth again. Yet as long as people believed in goodness, there would always be someone, some old lady with knitting and sharp eyes, to notice when something was amiss. She smiled faintly, reached for her tea and whispered into the stillness, "Rest now, Emily Carter. You've done your part." Then she sipped her tea, perfectly calm, as the clock chimed midnight and the village at last exhaled. The dawn broke pale and uncertain over St. Mary Mead, the kind of morning that seems to hover between endings and beginnings. The church bell tolled softly, though no one yet dared step into its shadow. The village, still trembling from recent days, had settled into that uneasy quiet that follows tragedy, a silence too deliberate to be called peace. Miss Marple rose as she always did, before the sun had fully burned through the mist, and stood by her kitchen window with her teacup in hand. The roses in her garden glistened faintly with dew, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe that all might return to normal. Yet she knew better. Death leaves a residue faint as dust that never truly fades. It lingers in conversations, in glances across the lane, in the way people lower their voices when the name of the dead is mentioned. There was one thing still troubling her, and Miss Marple had never been a woman to leave a matter unresolved. Mr. Temple's confession had satisfied the law, but it had not satisfied her sense of proportion. Evil, she often said, is rarely solitary. It prefers company. Her mind returned to the faint discrepancy she had noticed the night before. The bishop's seal on those letters. That small brown wax mark had changed everything, though she doubted Inspector Craddock would see it that way. He was a good man, practical and conscientious, but he had not lived long enough among village folk to understand that wickedness, like virtue, often hides in the smallest habits. By 8 o'clock she had put on her grey coat and sensible shoes and stepped out into the lane. The morning air was crisp, with that faint scent of burning wood that always accompanied the first chill of autumn. She walked toward the vicarage, her pace slow and deliberate, her knitting bag swinging lightly from her wrist. The nurse was just leaving the house as she arrived, a young woman with kind eyes, who informed her that Mrs. Temple was awake but not receiving visitors. Miss Marple smiled, thanked her, and slipped quietly around to the garden instead. The back door, as she suspected, was unlatched. It always had been. Mrs. Temple believed in openness even when the world around her no longer deserved it. Inside, the house was unnaturally still. She found Mrs. Temple in the drawing-room, seated at her writing desk, her hair neatly arranged, a shawl drawn around her shoulders. The woman started slightly at Miss Marple's entrance, then managed a wan smile. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "you shouldn't have come. There's nothing more to be said." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied, setting down her knitting bag. "There is something, my dear. I should not rest easy if I left it unsaid. You see, I have a particular dislike for loose ends, and this business, for all its sorrow, still has one dangling." Mrs. Temple's eyes flickered toward the desk drawer, just for an instant, but it was enough. Miss Marple noticed. "You've been busy, haven't you?" she said kindly. "Tidying up your husband's affairs. It's a noble impulse, so very English, if I may say so, to put things in order before others can pry. But I'm afraid you've gone a little further than order, haven't you? You've destroyed evidence." The woman's composure trembled. "I've destroyed nothing that matters," she whispered. "Only letters that would have caused needless shame. My husband was guilty enough without his name being dragged through the mud." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, I understand. Love makes us loyal to the undeserving. But you see, those letters, particularly the ones with the brown seal, weren't written by your husband at all, were they? You forged them after his arrest to make it seem as though he had been acting alone. You feared the diocese would uncover more, that the funds had been mishandled longer than anyone realized." Mrs. Temple's face went very still, the faintest tremor in her hands, the only betrayal of her calm. "You're mistaken," she said faintly, but her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple sighed almost gently. "No, my dear, I'm not. You see, the diocese changed its seal last March. I remember because my nephew Raymond mentioned it when he came for Easter. You couldn't have known that, of course. You never saw the new correspondence. So when you copied the old one, you betrayed yourself." The silence that followed stretched long and taut. At last Mrs. Temple spoke, her voice scarcely more than a whisper. "I did it for him, for both of us. We'd lost so much already, the house, the parish, our friends. I thought if I could just make it look complete, if it could end tidily, then perhaps the world would forget. People forgive the dead, Miss Marple, but they never forgive the disgraced." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Yes, I've found that to be true. But lies, my dear, never stay buried. They have roots like weeds. Pull one and 3 more rise in its place." Mrs. Temple's eyes filled with tears. "What will you do?" Tell the police? Certainly not, Miss Marple replied, her tone brisk but kind. The police have had quite enough scandal for 1 week. You will, however, write a letter to the diocese this afternoon. Say a proper one, with your own name upon it, returning the remainder of the funds and explaining, truthfully this time, what was done in your husband's name. If you do that, I believe the bishop will be merciful. He's a man of sense as well as faith. And then perhaps you might find peace. Mrs. Temple bowed her head, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Miss Marple reached out and placed a gentle hand upon hers. You are not the first woman to lose herself trying to save a man, she said softly. Nor will you be the last. But repentance, unlike deceit, has a way of healing even the deepest wounds. When she left the vicarage, the sky had brightened into a pale, forgiving blue. The village was stirring again. The post office reopened under a temporary clerk. Children chased one another across the green, and Mrs. Prothero could be seen hanging her washing as though the world had never turned dark. Life, Miss Marple thought, was determined to carry on, indifferent to tragedy, yet nourished by it all the same. As she reached her garden gate, she noticed a figure approaching along the lane, Inspector Craddock walking with his usual purposeful stride. He raised his hat when he saw her. Morning, Miss Marple. I've just come from the vicarage. Mrs. Temple sent for me. Wanted to hand over some documents. Said she'd been thinking about your words last night. Ah, Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. Then she's done the right thing. Craddock studied her curiously. You knew she'd confess? I suspected she might, Miss Marple replied. It's never too late to tell the truth, Inspector. Only too late to be forgiven. He nodded slowly, a look of quiet respect passing over his face. You have a remarkable way of seeing through people, Miss Marple. Not remarkable at all, she said modestly. Just experience, and a lifetime of watching how people behave when they think no one notices. He chuckled softly. Well, the village owes you thanks again. Heaven help us if you ever decide to retire from detective work. Oh, I've no intention of doing that, she said lightly. There's always something to keep one occupied in St. Mary Mead. Human nature, after all, never takes a holiday. As he tipped his hat and walked away, Miss Marple turned toward her cottage, where the scent of tea and freshly baked scones awaited her. The garden, glistening under the morning sun, seemed once more to belong to the living. She paused for a moment, glancing back at the lane, and murmured quietly, "And so ends the matter of the hidden letter." Yet in her heart she knew it would not truly end. No story ever did. The past lingered like a faint shadow on the grass, a reminder that even in the gentlest of villages, darkness was never far from the light. The morning passed quietly, with the kind of deceptive calm that often follows a storm. Miss Marple sat by her window with her sewing, the rhythmic motion of the needle allowing her mind to wander as it pleased. Outside, the world appeared almost innocent again, the children laughing near the green, the milk cart rattling by, the faint clatter of church bells rehearsed for Sunday service. Yet beneath that ordinary hum of village life, she felt the faint tremor of something unresolved, a thread that had not yet been pulled tight. Crimes, she had learned long ago, did not simply end because confessions were made or culprits removed. They ended when understanding settled in the hearts of those left behind, and that, she knew, had not yet happened here. By late afternoon, a soft knock came at her door. When she opened it, Mrs. Temple stood there, pale but composed, her shawl pulled tightly about her shoulders. "I wanted to thank you," she said simply, "for sparing me further shame." Miss Marple ushered her in with quiet warmth. "My dear, there's no shame in facing the truth. Only in fleeing from it." Mrs. Temple sank into the armchair by the fire, her gaze distant. "The bishop has accepted my letter," she said softly. "He'll see that the remaining funds are restored. He was kinder than I expected. He said my husband's name would not be erased entirely, only amended. In light of human frailty, he said. Such a merciful phrase." Her voice trembled, though her eyes were dry. Miss Marple poured tea for them both. Mercy, Mrs. Temple, is a difficult virtue. It demands more courage than punishment ever does. You must take comfort that you have done what is right." The woman nodded faintly, yet her expression remained clouded. "And yet," she murmured, "I can't stop thinking of Emily Carter. She was trying to help me, wasn't she? If I had only understood her warning sooner, none of this might have happened." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Perhaps not, but life rarely affords us such clarity in the moment. We see patterns only after they're complete. Emily did what she could with what she knew. She was brave in her way, and that is no small thing." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, the fire crackling between them. Then, almost as if remembering herself, Mrs. Temple straightened. "I'll be leaving St. Mary Mead, of course. I couldn't stay after all that's happened. The bishop suggested I go to stay with his sister in Devon for a time. It's quiet there," he said. "Peaceful." "Peaceful sounds very good indeed," Miss Marple replied gently. "But remember, peace isn't a place, my dear. It's something one must make within oneself. Still, I think Devon will suit you nicely. Sea air has a way of clearing both the lungs and the conscience." Mrs. Temple smiled faintly at that, the first true smile Miss Marple had seen from her. "Perhaps you're right," she said. "I shall try." She rose then, taking Miss Marple's hands. "Goodbye, Miss Marple. I owe you more than I can ever say." When she had gone, the cottage seemed quieter than before. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her eyes following the fading light across the garden. She thought of all that had passed, the fete, the poisoned tea, the letters, the frightened faces of those who had believed themselves good until circumstance revealed otherwise. It was a sad business, and yet in its own way a necessary one. The truth, however painful, had restored balance. Still, a part of her could not help but wonder whether justice ever truly finished its work. That evening Inspector Craddock called again, less formally this time. He found Miss Marple in her garden, pruning roses by the glow of her lantern. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, his tone lighter than it had been in days. "I thought you'd like to know. The coroner's verdict came in. Suicide confirmed for Cresswell and Mrs. Finch. As for Temple, manslaughter reduced by confession. I'd say that's as tidy as we'll ever see it." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Tidy enough for the record, Inspector. But you and I both know the law deals only with deeds, not reasons. The heart is a far messier business." He smiled wryly. "You're not wrong there. Still, I can't say I'm sorry to have it closed. This village gives me more grey hairs than London ever did." She chuckled softly. "That's because, my dear Inspector, you're used to crimes of ambition. Here we have crimes of conscience, and those are infinitely more exhausting." Craddock laughed, shaking his head. "You've a way with words, Miss Marple. Sometimes I wonder why you never wrote a book." "Oh, heavens, no," she said with mock horror. "I should never manage to keep it tidy. Life refuses to fit neatly into chapters." He tipped his hat and left her to her roses. The lantern's glow flickered as the wind shifted, casting long shadows along the garden path. When she finally went indoors, she placed the last of her notes into a small wooden box, tied neatly with twine, and tucked it away in a drawer marked Concluded Matters. Yet before closing it, she paused, her hand resting lightly on the cover. "The hidden letter," she murmured softly. A curious name for such a tale, for in truth the letter was never truly hidden, only misread. That thought pleased her. She closed the drawer, extinguished the lamp, and prepared for bed. The night was still, the stars sharp against the dark sky. She lay awake for a while, listening to the faint rustle of the trees beyond her window, the comforting murmur of life continuing as it always did. And as her eyes drifted shut, she thought again of Emily Carter, quiet, dutiful Emily, whose courage had begun it all. It was a sad ending, yes, but also a reminder that goodness, though often fragile, had its own strength. The next morning dawned bright and clear, with the scent of honeysuckle drifting in through the open window. Miss Marple rose early once again, her steps steady, her heart at ease. She prepared her tea, set out her knitting, and opened the Morning Post. which contained nothing more sinister than a letter from her nephew Raymond complaining of London fog. She smiled as she read it, thinking how different the world seemed from one day to the next, and yet how very much the same it always was. St. Mary Mead was returning, as it always did, to its rhythm of small domestic dramas and well-intentioned mischief. Mrs. Prothero had already taken over the post office temporarily, and was finding it quite stimulating. The gossip about the Temples would fade, replaced soon enough by new talk of an engagement, a quarrel, or perhaps the vicar's replacement. Life, Miss Marple reflected, was mercifully forgetful. As she stepped into her garden to cut a few roses for the breakfast table, the sunlight glinted on something near the hedge, a scrap of paper half buried in the soil. She bent and picked it up. It was a torn corner of an envelope, yellowed and faintly stained with what might once have been blood. The handwriting, though faded, was unmistakable. Emily Carter's. Miss Marple held it for a moment, then smiled gently and laid it among the petals in her basket. Some mysteries, she thought, never quite end. They linger just enough to remind one to keep looking closely, to keep noticing, to never grow complacent. And so, as the church bells began to chime across the morning air, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, humming softly. There would be another story someday, there always was, but for now St. Mary Mead was at peace. And peace, she knew, was only ever borrowed, never bought. The following Sunday arrived with an air of reluctant calm, as though the village itself wished to draw a curtain over the events of the past week. St. Mary Mead was dressed once again in its familiar tranquillity, the scent of lavender in cottage gardens, the faint chatter of sparrows, the distant chime of the church bell marking the morning service. Yet beneath the surface hum of ordinary life, the story of the hidden letter still lingered, its shadow stretching quietly through memory and whispered conversation. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual neat grey, walked toward the church with her parasol in hand. Her pace was unhurried, her expression serene. The villagers nodded respectfully as she passed, grateful perhaps, though few of them fully understood how much they owed to her quiet persistence. The vicarage was shuttered now, its windows curtained, its gates closed. Mrs. Temple had left 2 days earlier for Devon, accompanied by the same nurse who had tended her through her illness. Her departure had been discreet, as she had wished. Inspector Craddock had gone back to London. The case, as far as the law was concerned, was over. But for Miss Marple, it was not simply a matter of justice. It was a meditation on human frailty, and she found herself reflecting upon it as she took her usual seat in the church pew. The service was a short one, a new curate conducting it with nervous sincerity. His sermon was on truth, how it frees but also wounds, and as he spoke Miss Marple found herself smiling faintly. Truth, she thought, did both those things very well. It had freed Mrs. Temple from the lies that bound her to her husband's sins, but it had wounded her too, stripping away the illusion that kindness and goodness were always the same. It had freed Emily Carter posthumously from the suspicion of meddling, and it had revealed in her quiet courage something almost holy. Even the unfortunate Caroline Finch had played her part, as vanity often does, in drawing the mask from guilt. The hidden letter had done its work. Its warning had echoed through lives and left no soul untouched. After the service, Miss Marple lingered in the churchyard, admiring the late roses that bloomed near the stone wall. The day was bright, but her mind wandered to that first afternoon at the fete, the laughter, the sunlight, the scream that had shattered it all. How swift the descent from gaiety to tragedy, she thought, and how little people truly change. They sin, they repent, they gossip, and then they forget, each one convinced that their small corner of the world is somehow immune to darkness. But human nature, she knew, was a steady companion to both light and shadow. As she stood there, Reverend Harper, the new curate, approached her shyly. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've heard a great deal about your remarkable assistance to the inspector. It must be quite dreadful seeing such wickedness so near one's home. She turned to him, her eyes bright with mild amusement. Oh, wickedness, my dear boy, is never very far from home. It's rather like mildew. It thrives best where people forget to look for it. But you mustn't trouble yourself about that. Villages are like families. They quarrel, they forgive, they gossip, and sometimes, alas, they kill. But they remain families all the same. The curate looked slightly alarmed, uncertain whether to laugh, and she gave him a kindly pat on the arm. "You'll do very well here," she said. "Just remember to listen when people think they're not speaking. You'll learn more that way than from any sermon you give." She left him there, blinking in polite bewilderment, and made her way back along the lane. The air was fresh, the world clean once more, and as she reached her garden gate, she paused to look back at the church tower rising above the village rooftops. For all its faults, St. Mary Mead remained what it had always been, a place where life continued in spite of everything, where sin and innocence coexisted in delicate balance. Inside her cottage, she set aside her parasol, removed her gloves, and prepared her tea. On the table lay the torn scrap of Emily Carter's letter, the last remnant of the tragedy. She had pressed it between the pages of her Bible, not out of piety, but as a reminder that truth, however painful, was worth preserving. She looked at it for a long moment, before closing the book gently and setting it aside. Then she took her knitting, adjusted her spectacles, and began her afternoon's work. Her needles clicked softly in the hush of the room. Outside, the church bells rang again, steady, familiar, forgiving. In another village, she thought, there would be another mystery someday, another tangle of secrets waiting patiently for someone to see what others had missed. And when that day came, she would be ready, as she always was, quietly observant, endlessly curious, and entirely underestimated. For now, though, all was as it should be. The garden glowed in the late sun, the teapot steamed gently, and the peace of St. Mary Mead settled around her like a soft shawl. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself and whispered, almost as a benediction, "People do so like to think themselves good, but goodness, like truth, requires constant tending." And with that, she sipped her tea and went back to her knitting, the rhythm of her needles echoing the steady pulse of the village beyond her window, timeless, watchful, and utterly at peace, at least for now.